So which armies in Warhammer 40k are struggling by the numbers right now? Let's talk through the bottom 10 armies in terms of tournament win rates. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking through some of the armies that might be struggling a bit more than others in Warhammer 40k currently, how their numbers are looking, and any of the factors that might cause them to be having a tougher time than most at the moment. For this one, for a rough and ready power scale, again I'll be going by tournament win percentage, which I'd say is probably the most meaningful statistic to the majority of people out there. Definitely lots of issues and factors that can affect it, but does represent the current average experience for a normal player turning up to tournaments and events with at least a somewhat good list for the army. Even if it certainly doesn't tell the whole picture, top event performance is maybe best looked at through the amount of people actually winning tournaments or going undefeated, so I'll also take a look at armies that have won their first 5 games in tournaments and the amount of victories that they've had there, and a couple of other metrics with some casual win rates and the number of people choosing to put the faction on the tabletop in the first place, and whether or not it's looking high or low for the given army. All this comes from a whole bunch of range of 40k sources. There's plenty of people who track win rates out there, probably some of the most helpful being Meta Monday for up-to-date tournament data, StatCheck 40k with their rather excellent look back at the 40k meta with interactive charts that you can filter and things, Goonhammer with their more casual dataset, tracking games through their Tabletop Battles app, and Best Coast Pairings themselves and the regional equivalents to take a look at tournament winning lists and event runs. I'll link all of those down in the video description as usual for these ones. I would say that when looking at these, it does maybe feel like 40k game balance maybe feels like it's taken a small step back compared with how it's been before. I still say that overall things really aren't too bad. In general, turning up with a well thought through army list and played by someone who knows the game inside and out is generally going to win against virtually any faction otherwise, but it does look like there's a bunch of armies that are ranking towards the bottom end of the meta, either at or below the previously stated 45% win target that Games Workshop had in the past, and I kind of wonder if it might just be a slightly higher tier of armies that are pushing a bunch of other factions down there. Things like Thousand Sons, Death Guard, and both flavours of Knights seem to be doing just enormously well recently. It's definitely not all bad stuff, but it does feel that some armies are just going to have some big uphill struggles playing into certain others at the moment. First up, before going through the top 10 themselves, here's the sort of middle tier of Warhammer 40k, at least by tournament win rates by Meta Monday's data. These ones between 47 and 49% win rates, and here we have Genestealer Cults, Chaos Space Marines and Tau, World Eaters, Eldari and Emperor's Children. I feel like all of these are doing well enough in themselves, though maybe not crazy standouts. World Eaters have certainly had a whole bunch of top event placings in particular, but certainly if we were just going by tournament win rates, things on 47% aren't exactly much higher than the first few on this list, which are at 46. I'll also mention here that I'm going to exclude Index Space Wolves now. In theory they would have featured on the list at around about 45% currently. The Games Workshop have just made their Points Go tournament live, and it looks like with the stats that people have been playing with them in more casual games, the new codex has been doing kind of well. Jumping into it though, I've chosen to include one more on the list, seeing as there were 3 on 46%, plus for doing a top 10 weakest you always have to talk about Imperial Agents, which so far Games Workshop aren't really showing that they're wanting to treat like a normal faction for balance. In any case, first up, and in 11th place we have the Grey Knights. They're winning around about 46% of tournament games, so a small decrease prior to the last balance update, and that's similar sort of win rates for casual games. It looks like just 2 players have managed to go 5 games undefeated for the first 5 in grand tournaments, though that in itself maybe isn't absolutely awful given they're not being played all that much. They're the 21st most played faction out of 28. Not loads of excitement for putting them on the table right now. The last balance changes that they had were a cheaper Brotherhood champion, some slightly cheaper Terminator squads if you fill them in 10s, and Warpbane rerolls no longer get turned off if you're fighting in melee and can't see your target through a wall. Overall it wasn't really anything that was going to affect the faction power in any big way though. For currently strong options, generally people tend to take the Warpbane Task Force with the big inbuilt rerolls and the Purifier benefits, plus abilities to get some close 6-inch charges if you set them up. It seems to be both solidly more played and outperforming the Teleport Force in the stats. The majority of Grey Knight lists are using 3 or more Dread Knights to handle tough stuff, maybe even more relevant than normal with Knights around in a big way. Otherwise, Drago plus Terminators, Purifiers in the Warpbane Task Force, and then some Strike Marines and Interceptors for utility support generally tend to be staples. I still say that one of their biggest issues is being able to handle big tough targets, which isn't ideal against the powerhouse armies like Knights, and maybe a bit locked into using Dread Knight spam to try and cope with that. Overall it feels like the faction hasn't really got any worse, but it's just lacking for a little bit of overall strength, particularly with a whole bunch of powerful codex having been released or updated recently. I guess it won't be too long till they get a codex which will hopefully bring some interesting different ways to play. Next up on 10th we've got the Astra Militarum. It looks like they're also on 46% wins for the tournament data. They seem to be doing even worse at more casual data from Goonhammer, down at 43. just the one 5-0 undefeated run that I could find in the first 5 games. I believe that was their win with the recon element detachment with the big horde list. Having so little top tournament performance feels very unusual for Guard recently. In general, they've been an army that, while more normal players have been struggling with them, the top players have usually still been able to make them work. They certainly seem to be winning events or breaking into the top tables a fair bit less frequently. Their play rate has also slid down quite a bit as well. Being played 12th out of the 28 factions, again, is very low for Guard. They're one of the more popular armies in Warhammer 40k, maybe showing that people don't have much faith that they're going to be reaching top tables or winning events with them. The latest balance changes probably didn't help with that. There were some very direct nerfs to some of the best army lists out there. Orks is going up for transporting Kazakin, Leman Russ battle tanks increasing a bit, Creed going up quite a lot, and the 20-strong Krieg units for some reason. They did get a few buffs to compensate, but they usually fell on units that weren't really being played a whole load in competitive games. For playing them in a strong way, it still looks like it's the Hammer of the Emperor and the Combined Regiment as the ways to play. The Hammer focusing on their tank spam, maybe going very heavy on Rogal Dawns and Vanquishers and battle tanks and the like. Combined Arms Regiment getting you a whole bunch of lethal hits, the Reinforcement Stratagem and Fields of Fire. There does seem to be a bit of experiment with most of the rest as well, and that win for Recon Element. For their stronger units at the moment, generally Rogal Dawns tend to feature in a big way, particularly the Commander datasheet, though the regular one's fine as well. The Russ variants with the Battle Tank and Vanquisher are good. Kazakin and Transports are a nice damage dealer, moving very fast and then hitting hard with their orders after they disembark. It does seem that some people are being tempted to switch back to Chimeras now that Tauroxes went up in cost. People still use Tauroxes too though. Scout Sentinels tend to be really efficient between buffs and utility. Cadians and command squads are nice for sticky objectives and broadcasting orders about. Cast chance to fight for the mid-board, and Gaunt goes 2 bounce around the board doing secondaries. In spite of some very indomitable tank stat lines, it doesn't look like Guard are having the best time of it, at least so far post-update. They've got win rates towards the lower end of the spectrum, both competitively and casually, and not too many tournament wins. I did feel like some of the nerfs were pretty harsh last time around. The buff's not really particularly relevant to make the units that they affected actually strong, and I've still got loads of datasheets that are just overcosted or not useful enough. Most of their utility artillery with debuffs, and still plenty of the Krieg units. I don't think that the Death Riders dropped enough at the 60 points. Next up, and for the third one on 46%, there's the Drukhari. They seem to have dropped down a little bit compared with previous, though it might be sort of random chance due to them not being a super commonly played faction. Their more casual win rates are a fair bit better from Goonhammer, which does have more data. It doesn't seem that anyone's managed to take them to the first 5 games undefeated so far post-update that I've found though. Seems at least so far the buffs that they got in the last update haven't really improved their lot all that much. I don't think anyone was expecting them to do anything revolutionary, but they did get some quite direct things to some of their best units. Mandrakes, Raiders and Venoms all dropping down, Ravagers dropping a touch as well, and Reaper's Wager, their best attachment, getting some inbuilt re-rolls even if the Drukhari are winning the wager. Maybe not always a super impactful buff, but not bad to have an army-wide damage boost to their most played and most successful detachment. It still seems that people are either playing Reaper's Wager or Sky Splinter Assault, Reaper's Wager being a bit more popular and a bit more successful than the latter, and most units in the Codex are at least usable. Cabalites and Venoms good for objectives, Mandrake's nice for fading away and infiltrate, the Beastmaster for some early game screening and scoring. Scourges can be good to inflict damage for a long range, Incubi or Lilith with Witches are both really quite powerful jumping out of transport, a Kronos is well worth it to farm some pain tokens, and a Talos is a fairly solid damage dealer. Feels like they maybe do have quite a lot of units that are in the usable, unplayable, but not crazy standout sort of case of affairs at the moment though. Overall though, doesn't seem to be coming together to give them a lot of success on the tournament scene right now. They're not particularly far behind the middle of the pack, but don't seem to be doing well at the tops of events. Maybe quite a fragile and hard to use army, and being reliant on an allied detachment maybe not ideal. They're still waiting on a range refresh for a bunch of their kits too. That's unlikely to be helping with player numbers in the interim. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain, and their one option to get a battlefield worth of Warhammer 40k terrain on the go. They do things really quite differently to the majority of terrain sets out there, and basically their thing that they're going for is being super easy to store and transport with their system of folding cardboard tiles. The idea of these is that you have the tiles that are arranged in a 3x4 grid, making a 45-inch by 60-inch battlefield, the right size for 2000 point 40k, and then each of those tiles folds out and up pops a pop-up building. So I guess the unique selling point being that you can basically have an entire tabletop full of terrain that can store in a box set the same size as a standard board game. I have a few different designs and it's certainly cheaper than Games Workshop terrain, though I would say for this one there are some more obvious pros and cons versus other sets out there, and it won't be the right one for everyone. I'll talk through a few of the more common talking points at the end of the video. In any case though, if you'd like to check out their stuff, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. Getting back to the armies that are struggling for the average player in 40k though, next up we have the Tyranids, interestingly enough. Looks like they haven't been doing so great on the tournament scene over the past few weeks. Win rates for around about 45% from Meta Monday at grand tournaments, though their more casual event performance from Goonhammer does seem to be a bit better, that being at 48%. I do kind of wonder if they've had an initially bad first few weeks. Really quite a good amount of top tournament success. No less than 7 players going 5 games undefeated that I could find, which is quite impressive and definitely higher on the rankings than most, though we'll bear in mind that if you wait for the amount of people playing the faction, it becomes a bit less impressive. Waiting for players, it has them kind of mid-table in terms of top event wins and performance, 12th out of the 28 factions. Still though, being popular isn't necessarily a bad thing. Tyranids are always going to be popular in 10th, though it does look like people are keen to put them on the tabletop and think they can have some good chances to win at the moment. With the last balance changes, they had a fair few updates. Tyrants get fewer stratagems but got cheaper. There's the new Ravener datasheets, Subterranean Assault for close range charges with tunneler units, and the Psychophage getting a datasheet rewrite, and people have seemed to be enjoying its debuffing AP rule combined with certain units like say the Auspex. Just the other day they also had their recent small nerf to Subterranean Assault as well. One of the stratagems becoming a bit more restrictive, but it's not going to change things in a huge way. For detachment performance, it does look like the Subterranean Assault is having the best time of it right now. The Invasion Fleet is still the most popular, given that I guess not everyone has the models or the playstyle to play the Subterranean one. It does seem that Subterranean Assault has a much higher win rate in competitive play, 50% versus the 43% of Invasion so far, though they're a bit more close in casual. Beyond that, plenty of people still playing and having some good success with Vanguard Onslaught, Crusher Stampede and Assimilation Swarm as before. For strong units in general, they need to have some pretty powerful units to be able to take down tough stuff. Exocrines, Maleceptors, Norns and the Tyrannifex are all quite good for destroying heavy stuff, often with Hive Tyrants for free stratagem support. The Lictor variants are really good. A Lurking Biovore in the backfield is fairly auto-include to score some things, and maybe some Endless Multitudes for OC sweeping the enemy off objectives. The Brood Lord and Gene Stealers is a powerful melee damage dealer, and they're rather good in Vanguard Onslaught. And then a bunch of the detachments have some more standout units for them. The Vanguard and Assimilation ones have their keyworded units. The Subterranean one having some extra emphasis on some melee monsters, things like the Auspex being delivered by Trigons potentially, often using a Trigon Prime. For weaknesses at the moment, Tyranids still maybe don't get on particularly well against things that have big tough stat lines, and that's not great if they're going to be fighting against Imperial and Chaos Knights. I feel like Tyranids aren't going to have a great time if they're going to make up a big part of the meta for a while. At the moment they seem to be in a place where the average player isn't having the best time with them if they take them to grand tournaments, though it looks like a faction where a standout player can do well with them with the top event placings. Looks like Subterranean Assault is the one to go for at the moment though if you're trying to win a grand tournament. Next up and placing in 7th on this one are the Adeptus Mechanicus. They're on 45% wins and unchanged from prior to the update. Fairly similar things to the Goonhammer one with the casual win rates at 47% there. Lesser played in competitive play as they often are, 23rd out of the 28 factions, and so far just the one tournament run with the first 5 games undefeated. I want to say that might have been with Hunter Cohort. The last balance update they had did have a few small positives that didn't really feel like it was going to impact faction strength in a particularly big way. The Castellan robots got Doctriners at base finally. The Scorpius Disintegrator and Iron Striders got a touch cheaper, and they got their new Servitor Battleclade units from their kill team. For people taking them to tournaments, it still seems that people are using their Halo Screed detachment as the most common one, a few people using Hunter Cohort, and still say that the majority of their codex is usable, though most of it not exactly stand out strong once more. The Skitarii troops are necessary for buffing a bunch of units. The Scorpius Disintegrator and Onagers nice enough for a bit of anti-tank. Taraxian Infiltrators nice to screen and score. Some alright melee damage with the Rostalkers and maybe the Dragoons, particularly with the cheaper points. Cataphrone Breachers a nice general purpose damage output, particularly in Halo Screed. The Castellans can do okay as well there with the enhancement that one gives you. And Core himself isn't too bad for the cost between his auras and big stat line. Again, maybe still being an issue of just being a bit behind the power curve and only got a few small points nudges when there are a bunch of codexes that just entered at the top of Warhammer 40k that seem stronger than most at the moment. Still maybe feels like they're just lacking a bit of raw power and unit efficiency. Next up we've got the Space Marines, who as they often have a bit of a disparity between their win rate and their top tournament success. Tournament win rates are around about 44% via Meta Monday, which does seem to have fallen a touch since the previous update. It looks like that's pretty similar for more casual games from Goonhammer. However, they have been doing well at the tops of tournaments as well, 6 players having gone the first 5 games undefeated, though again like the Tyranids that has to be taken in context of the amount of people playing the faction, Space Marines are 6th out of the 28 right now, and once you weight them for a fairly good number of players, again they look a bit more mid-table on the top event performance. I think that usually comes from just a vast amount of models available to the Space Marines, and there often being really quite big power differences between the different lists that you might run with them. An absolutely optimised list might do pretty well, and in particular, if you want to play stronger Space Marines at the moment, it's still looking like Ultramarines, whereas the average player's collection just might not have the same amount of power. It's interesting that Space Marines seem to have been struggling more, if anything, despite getting a few points cuts in the last update. Hellblasters, Aggressors, Vanguard Veterans, Heavy Intercessors, and the Jump Captain all went down, as did Calgar and Guilliman, though Guilliman did get a nerf for his stratagem thing. I guess quite a few of those weren't necessarily units that were being used in competitive play before though, so didn't necessarily add strength. For detachments being used, it's still the Gladius that's the single most played one. Vanguard, Ironstorm, and Stormlance also looking good, and Firestorm still getting plenty of play, though not really much success, as usually seems to be the case with that one. Seems that someone was able to win a big super major with them recently, an Ultramarine Stormlance list taking down the Leeds Grand Tournament, so I guess one of the examples of Space Marines still having what it takes to reach the top tables there. For a few of their more standout units in their vast array, Guilliman and Calgar are both still pretty excellent. Space Marines have got loads of nice skirmishing units between Scouts, Infiltrators, Intercessors, Incursors and Jump Intercessors, all working together to use their different special rules to score objectives and skirmish well. Gun tanks enjoy boosted at the moment with a +1 to wound, plenty of solid options to choose from, maybe in particular Vindicators and Ballistas Dreadnoughts being quite popular. A Combi Lieutenant makes it into the majority of competitive lists. Nice utility with his reactive movement and lone operative things, though some of the exact big damage combos might vary a fair bit depending on detachment or chapter. As mentioned earlier, I still feel like maybe Space Marine's internal balance isn't the best in the world at the moment. Ultramarines doing better than most and being a very big difference between a fully optimised list versus the units that any one person might have available. And there's still plenty of overshadowed units that are just kind of rarely seen at the moment. Looks like the average player is struggling with them if they're not building an optimised Ultramarine tournament list. Next up, and also ranking down on 44% wins, are the Black Templars. That's admittedly a couple of percentage points higher than they used to be before, though I would say that this is from notably low data. Very few people are playing the faction at the moment, and on the Grand Tournament scene it looks like they're the 27th most played faction out of 28, only more than Imperial Agents. Goonhammer's Casual Games has a bit more data, and they're up at 46% there. It does look like, at their very small player base, 2 people have managed to go 5 games undefeated with them, which is actually fairly impressive for the population that's playing them. Maybe a bit like the Admech, they're an army that were struggling prior to the balance update and then got a bunch of small nudges towards being slightly more effective. Small points drops to characters and Sword Brethren and Big Crusader squads, though nothing enormous. They still tend to be playing with their Righteous Crusaders detachment, maybe getting Feel No Pain or melee buffs with some helpful melee tricks, and the Turnhouse's bones for some Feel No Pain. Particularly after the points drops, their most standout unit still feels like it's Sword Brethren plus Hellbrechts, who are just an absolute danger to anything that they can get into melee with. Maybe backed up by some other Sword Brethren squads led by different characters, and possibly transported into battle with impulsors with multi-melters on the top. Having some sort of big tanky unit with a 5+ Feel No Pain from Turnhouse's bones is also pretty tempting as well, particularly for Assault Terminators. Overall though, it doesn't look like they're having the best time at the moment, and not many people motivated to play them. It just doesn't really seem like the points drops have done quite enough to turn them around just yet, and maybe a fair few people might be waiting on their codex to finally come out, as that should hopefully add a fair bit more interest to the faction. Next up, we've got the Dark Angels, who really don't seem to be doing quite so great on the competitive scene from the first few weeks. Only 43% wins, dropping 1% on where they were before. They're seemingly doing a bit better in casual games at 46, they're still on the lower end of 40k in general. Again, they are an army that haven't been doing quite so bad in terms of actual top event performance though. 5 players managing to go the first 5 games undefeated. That's at least a fairly good number of people playing the army. Fairly mid-table for the play rates at 13th out of 28. Looks like the Wrath of the Rock detachment got a few people interested in playing them once again. Those were the 2 major things from the last balance update. Lionel Johnson's got some interesting buffs on a few different levels. They had the new Wrath of the Rock with the -1 to wound against their infantry and mounted units, plus a few fun and powerful stratagems, and a few of the marine changes helped to touch. Cheaper plasma fire with some Hellblasters isn't the worst news for some Dark Angels who enjoy them. Even if they might not be doing quite so great on the power spectrum, it does look like Games Workshop have finally managed to make a Dark Angels detachment that people actually embrace more than the core Codex ones. Their new detachment is easily the most played thing, and it does seem to be on the upper end compared with the other ones for their win percentages at the moment. They're still only just about limping into 45% or so. The detachment's really quite infantry and mounted focus, so no real surprise that they go heavy on those, often taking their usual dangerous melee units like Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions, Azrael still being basically auto-include, Plenty of people seem to be using some Stern Guard with fighty character enhancements, which can really hit hard into the oath of moment, and Lionel Johnson is turning up in a few more army lists than before, after a few nice datasheet rule boosts. It does seem that quite a lot of people are having fairly different takes on how to use the Wrath of the Rock one. Some quite different flavours of support units and main damage dealers being used, maybe things like Eradicators and Hellblasters and Stern Guard all being experimented with. Despite all this, it still doesn't seem that Infantry Heavy Space Marines is winning a huge amount. The Wrath of the Rock did strike me as one that might do a bit better in more casual play versus competitive. That's often seemed to be the way for detachments that have a defence-focused primary rule. There are some cool tricks in the stratagems, I suppose. Feels like they maybe wouldn't need much of a boost to become a really quite strong army indeed. It might be nice if Games Workshop started with some help for some of their other character datasheets. Besides Azrael and the Lion, very few of their on-foot 1C play. Next up, and currently clocking in at third in terms of armies with the lowest win rates at tournaments, are the Orks. Looks like they've dropped down to 42% wins from 46 in terms of Grand Tournament win rates, and the casual data from Goonhammer really doesn't look much better, around about 44. Compared with pre-update, they seem notably absent from top table performance, only having had 2 players go 5-0 undefeated. That certainly seems like a big decrease compared with pre-update. Even after Mordaka was nerfed, they were doing okay on that metric. And in terms of people putting them on the table, that's maybe one of the most dramatic things. Seeing Orks being basically the 18th most played army in the game is just crazy low for Orks, given they're one of the most popular factions and tend to have people playing them through thick and thin. The last balance changes were broadly pretty bad news for army strength. They finally gave a little bit of help to the Cult of Speed, decreasing some buggy prices and buffing the detachment rule, but not really enough to make it one of the strongest detachments, and then had a bunch of focal nerfs to just some of the power units and combos that people were most tempted to play in competitive lists, maybe seeming particularly harsh to Tactical Brigade with things like the Shock Attack Gun Mech, Looters, Tank Busters and Big Flash Kit mobs all going up, and then some other staples like Trucks and Big Boys mobs were increased as well. For people still bravely trying to play and win with Orks, it looks like Warhorde is the way now. It looks like it's the most played and has best performance, though still clearly not doing all that well. Tactical and Dread Mob are the next most played on the competitive scene at the moment, it seems, having had a bunch of the more peripheral options nerfed. Maybe feels like it's a bit of a return to form, with the big melee units jumping out of transport, Boys, Knobs, Breaker Boys, and maybe Gasgol with Mega Knobs, and a whole bunch of them using trucks, wagons or kill rigs to get them there. Flash kits and tank busters are still useful, despite some points increase to some of them. Gretchen are basically auto-include to take objectives and farm command points, and some Storm Boys to bounce around the board. It did kind of seem some questionable balance updates to Orks though, given that they were already on the lower end of the win rates before, and then took some very direct nerfs to some of their best stuff. They now seem to be in the position where even their strongest lists are having a bit of trouble. I feel like the Orks Codex in particular has a whole bunch of units that only just about get to be okay in their theme detachment, like Walkers in Dread Mob, Speedy Stuff in Cult of Speed, and perhaps Squig Hogs in their Big Hunt, where a bunch of those still seem to have points cost that just don't make them get played a lot elsewhere. Overall feels like the Greenskins could do with a bit of help though. Next up, and apparently ranking in second in terms of Grand Tournament performance, are the Deathwatch. These ones are definitely far more shaky to rate down here though, and I feel like it might not reflect reality quite as much as some of the ones with more data. Really not that many people have been turning out with them at fairly similar numbers to the Black Templars, though very slightly ahead of those. They're the 26th most played out of the 28 factions, but it certainly seems that with the people that have been turning up, they haven't been having lots of success so far. A 40% win rate competitively, and 42% win rates casually. Nobody managing to have taken them to a top level yet, though perhaps not really odds on to with so few people playing them. It is perhaps kind of surprising seeing as they had win rates around about the 50% sort of mark before. I don't know if just a few strong players have decided not to play the faction recently, not thinking that they'll have a good time against some of the other scary stuff out there. With so few players normally it wouldn't take much like that to affect them in a big way. They didn't really change too much in the last balance update. All their big kill team combos and things remain the same, and their armies generally take to the field using their Black Spear task force. Nice damage boost with the core rule, some good special issue ammo stratagems and teleport tricks, and some very good enhancements like free rapid ingress and the Tome of Ectoclades for some big damage, and the Thief of Secrets for big melee damage. Most of their kill teams are at least fairly interesting, maybe the big Gravis Armoured Indomitor one particularly so. The regular Deathwatch veterans and their Terminators are also really nice, and there's plenty of interesting enough leader combos for them. Overall though, my guess would be that this is a bit more reflective of low data and just not having too many competitive players playing the faction right now, aside from some scary things like Knights, Death Guard and Thousand Sons entering the tournament scene. They certainly didn't lose much in power, and they were winning around about the 50% sort of mark before, so still rank Deathwatch higher than this really, even if their stats aren't looking so great right now. I guess it might not be too long before they have some updates as well, if Games Workshop are indeed releasing something Deathwatch with their next previews as they seem to have hinted. Finally, and taking their rightful spot at the bottom of the army power rankings as per normal are the Imperial Agents. Tournament data looking pretty terrible, though is kind of meaningless really, given that nobody really plays them, aside from a few people doing so for the challenge or fun factor. I'll not go on about them too much, given that not much has changed for them and doesn't really seem to be likely to. They generally use the Imperialis fleet for some board control tricks to win games for people playing them. Things like chaff units like sub-doctor squads, navy breachers, skirmishing assassins, and maybe some Deathwatch veterans if wanted to do some damage are pretty nice. And probably some allied knights, perhaps particularly Canis Rex at the moment, will be a pretty good idea to throw in if you're wanting some threat. Interestingly enough, they did get at least a fairly good buff to the fleet enhancement in the FAQs the other day, basically saying that characters can be attached to the deep striking or infiltrating units from their Imperialis fleet enhancements, so you might be able to use those a bit more efficiently now without having to have characters placed elsewhere. Maybe not unhelpful for moving in the right direction, but on the other hand, it's definitely not going to revolutionise the faction or anything like that. As ever with these guys, the thing they need most is for Games Workshop to actually treat them as a normal faction in 40k and show them some love. Not really clear if they're going to do so or not, but some sort of core rule and some sort of in-codex way to be able to deal with tanks and monsters out there would be a good start. That just about brings us to the end of the main list though, so here's a few rankings of some tables to sum up. Here are the armies that are doing worst in terms of getting 5-0 undefeated runs. Seems like a pretty solid correlation with the ones that are getting low win rates here as well. The Emperor's Children don't seem to be having a great time by that stat as well, they're quite low here too. And here's what happens if you weight those higher placings by play rates. A few of the armies that had some performance get higher there due to not many people playing them. Notably things like Blood Angels and Custodians drop down though, who haven't really seen too much top tournament success, but have loads of people playing them. Here's the lowest 15 by people choosing to play the army. Again, some fairly good correlation with the ones that aren't doing quite so good here. Sisters and Genes to the Cults are amongst the lower played ones that are doing better. And finally, here's the overall win rates once again. It does feel like there's quite a lot of factions clustered around the sort of 45% kind of mark. Let me know your thoughts as to the armies that seem to be struggling more in Warhammer 40k though, and does this correlate with your experiences on the tabletop or not? That's the end of this one, but before I go I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor, and that's Titan's Terrain with their Battlefield in a Box. As mentioned earlier, I feel like they're one of the terrain sets that maybe has some of the more obvious biggest advantages and disadvantages compared with some. The biggest draws, the main one is being super easy to store and transport, all the pieces folding down to fit in a normal sized board game box. That's quite a big deal for some people without loads of space. It is far cheaper than a whole board worth of Games Workshop terrain, at least somewhat comparable to MDF. It doesn't need any hobby work to get it ready straight away. It doesn't need painting or assembly, so ready to go immediately and save hobby hours for your army. For the downsides, it does have some negatives though. It is made of folding cardboard, so by nature it's going to be less sturdy or hard wearing than plastic or MDF. It needs a little bit more looking after, and the ruins aren't exactly weight bearing, so not much option for putting any heavy miniatures in the top floors or anything like that. The other main criticism I've seen is the grid layout being a bit less flexible than some. You can get some variation by rotating the tiles and things, though I'd be tempted to add a little bit of just regular terrain on top of it to break up some of the firing lanes when using it for Warhammer 40k. It doesn't exactly make tournament approved boards, but maybe nice enough ones for more casual play. In any case, for the sets they have available, they've got 3 main ones. There's this Forgotten Furnace one, which is all chaos glowing runes and foundries and things. There's a Shattered Hive one with a bunch of bombed out buildings and armoured containers, a more standard ruined city. And then they have an overgrown capital one, some more verdant ruins that could be appropriate for fantasy or the distant future. Each of those also comes with an expansion centerpiece set, a big cathedral type thing for a couple of them, and then an infernal spire for the foundry. These ones are made by putting 2 tiles together. In any case though, check them out, links down in the video description below if you'd like to take a look at their stuff, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, and check out the links down in the video description if you'd like to support the channel. There's various discount links for saving money on Warhammer that help to support Auspex Tactics, and also the channel's Patreon page as well if you'd like to take a look over that. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.